Hi, welcome. We are so excited to be here with this webinar presented by NAAEE, the North American Association for Environmental Education, and also from our affiliate co-hosts, including Colorado, Kentucky, New Mexico, Maine, and North Dakota. This webinar today is on ideas and tools for effective evaluation provided with support from EE Capacity, but will be followed by two additional webinars on collective impact and fundraising. So we'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of the webinar. For now, I would like to introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Michaela Zint, who is a professor of environmental education and communication at the University of Michigan. And her research focuses on how environmental education can best encourage individuals to act in ways that will contribute to environmental quality through evaluation. And she has published a number of environmental education program evaluations, developed 2 national program evaluation systems, and created the My Environmental Education Evaluation Resource Assistant, or MEERA, which we'll talk more about today, a free resource to support the evaluation efforts of environmental educators. So we are so excited to have her to share some tips and tricks and best practices in evaluation for environmental education today. So thank you again for joining us, Michaela, and I will turn it over to you.
Katie, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and I'm indeed very excited to talk to you all about evaluation today. I think evaluation is a critical subject. It is critical to the success of environmental education programs in my experiences, and so I'm very pleased to share some of the things I know about this topic with you all. So let's get started. Today, the questions that I will try to answer for you is first some background questions about evaluation, and then I think a very important question of whether or not program evaluation is actually something you would want to start with. And then finally introduce you to MEERA and some other resources that can help you with evaluating your programs. So before I begin, though, with providing you all with that background, I want to just talk to you a little bit about the value of program evaluation by sharing an example of an evaluation that I did in collaboration with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I suspect many of you are familiar with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's education programs. They have curricula, they have field trips and restoration projects that they offer for students. And they were interested in a question that I find most environmental educators are interested in, which is, to what extent do these programs actually change student behavior? And then another question that they had is, where should they put their funding? Should they put more funding, for example, towards 1-day versus 3-day programs? Which are more successful toward reaching that behavioral outcome goal that they have? And so we conducted an evaluation to answer those questions for them. And here you can see an overview of the results. In the left-hand column, you see a set of characteristics that have all been associated with environmentally responsible behaviors, meaning if we're able to increase students' characteristics in these areas, they're more likely to act on behalf of the environment. The subsequent columns are all the different kinds of programs that we looked at. And when you see a check mark, then you can tell that our evaluation showed that there was a change in the participants in that particular program with regards to the particular variable that we measured. So what you can see, for example, is the curriculum participants only changed in one particular area. They increased in their knowledge of issues as related to the Bay. Contrast that to the 3-day field trip and the 1-day field trip, where you see so many more check marks, suggesting that those particular programs were much more effective in increasing a larger number of characteristics that have been associated with environmentally responsible behavior. So what? We used this information, and it's a little bit more complex than I can share right now, to essentially come up with a rationale indicating to what extent these programs actually change behavior? We made the argument that because for the programs where there were a lot of check marks, especially with intention to act, which is the one most closely associated with behavior change, that there was a relatively good likelihood that these particular programs changed students' behavior. And that the curriculum was unlikely to achieve that goal. The other thing that we were able to do, or I should say the head of the program was able to do, is in comparing the 3-day and the 1-day field trip, notice how the 1-day field trip also has quite a lot of check marks relative to the 3-day field trips, kind of suggesting that, considering the resources that have to be invested in both these programs, that the 1st-day field trip, the 1-day field trip, I should say, did pretty well, and so they ended up deciding putting more resources into the 1-day than the 3-day because they felt they were getting, more for their buck, essentially. So this is an illustration I wanted to show you of the kind of data you can get through program evaluation and how it can help answer important questions as well as inform program decisions so you can, have the most effective programs possible for the minimum cost. So with that, I want to just do a little bit of, cover a little bit of background information about program evaluation. Here's a definition of program evaluation. Essentially, it does involve judgment. This is why a lot of people are not fans of evaluation. It definitely has that element. But what I want to stress, too, is notice that it suggests that a good program evaluation is used to inform program decisions. So it shouldn't just be about judgment. It should also be conducted such that it can actually help you improve your programs. The same element is repeated in the evaluation standards under the utility standard. We're going to say an evaluation is considered a good evaluation if it meets the needs of intended users. And intended users usually want to improve their program somehow. So within this context, I just want to stress that in program evaluation, there are also standards, just like we have standards in environmental education. We call them the guidelines for excellence. But evaluations should all meet these particular standards that have been decided upon by the American Evaluation Association. And in fact, I find that a lot of environmental educators are not sure about, how to choose, for example, sometimes an external evaluator to help them. One of the ways you can make that choice is by asking the external evaluator to tell you about how they're going to meet these particular standards as part of their evaluation, and then use their responses to these particular aspects to help you make a decision in who you might want to work with. So we've just talked about what program evaluation is, and I've tried to give you a feel for it through that case example. Let's talk a little bit more about why you might want to evaluate programs. In my experience, most people say they want to evaluate their programs because they want to have evidence of the success of these programs, partly because they're required by their funder to provide evidence of such success. And indeed, that's an important reason for doing program evaluation. But as I've just argued earlier, and based on the definition and based on the standards, really the primary reason to do program evaluation is to get information to help you improve your programs. I also believe that funders in the future are going to not just ask for evidence of success, but they're going to ask for how you've improved your program based on past program evaluation results. And I think if you want to stand out when you prepare your proposals, I would recommend you start addressing that aspect of it. There are two more reasons that I find most people are not familiar with, or they don't commonly think about for why to evaluate their programs. And one is that you can actually improve your program based on just being involved in the process of evaluation. So if you decide to evaluate your program, it provides you with time to think critically about your program. And because you're thinking critically about your program, right then and there, you're starting to think about how you might want to change it to improve it. And so there's actually evidence to suggest that just being involved in an evaluation without even having evaluation results ready, it's likely to have a positive impact on your program. And lastly, if you then decide to share your evaluation results, which I would argue is very important, you actually help to advance our knowledge of best environmental education practices, and I'll show you an example later of how that could benefit all of us. So now that we've made an argument for why to evaluate your programs, let's talk about what to actually evaluate. Traditionally, most environmental education programs or other programs tend to focus on, how many participants have taken part in the program, or they focus on how satisfied the participants are. But notice how there's many more elements that could potentially be evaluated. From the inputs, what are you actually spending, how much time, how many staff are involved in a program, to how are your programs implemented. Remember in that previous slide on the CBF, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation results, the curriculum did not perform very well? Well, it actually turns out that that was not the case. The issue was that the curriculum was not implemented as intended. Teachers only implemented 3 out of the 12 activities and did not implement the service learning project. So fortunately, we collected that data and we learned that the implementation was limited. And as a result, we really can't say that the curriculum was ineffective. We can say the implementation was ineffective, and that was very important for us to learn. Not only would you want to look at how many participants you reach, but also which participants. And then we talk about the outcomes. The outcomes are, often what we really care about in the end is did participants learn something new? Did they change their values or attitudes? Did they gain skills? Did they change their intentions to do something differently? Ultimately, does that lead to behavior change? And finally, does that then contribute to environmental quality? So I would argue all of these elements are important to evaluate about your program. So then the next question is, when should you evaluate these different aspects of your program? And so now that we've just talked about what you should consider evaluating about your program, the next question is, when do you evaluate these different aspects of your program? And there is something called Bennett's hierarchy, which is what you're looking at, and it can be really helpful in thinking through that. So let's look at this graphic, and if you look at this side of the right side of the graphic, that's the evaluation side, the program performance side. And what essentially Bennett is suggesting is that you evaluate these different aspects of your program in the hierarchy shown here. So you start with checking that you have the inputs that you think you are using, that your activities are being implemented as intended. It's reaching the participants that you hope and the numbers you hope, that they're satisfied, that they are learning new things and changing their attitudes and their skills and aspirations in the way that you hope. And only once that is in place, you look whether or not they've changed their practices or behaviors. And only once that is in place, you evaluate whether or not you're achieving environmental quality outcomes. And just for those of you interested in what the left side column is all about, that's the program development side. So there, the process Bennett is recommending is the opposite. Then when you're developing programs, you start out with what environmental conditions you want to change, what behaviors that would take, what type of knowledge, attitude, skill, and aspiration changes that would take, etc., and you work your way backwards. So this, again, this hierarchy is a useful way to think about when to evaluate what different aspects of your program. So next, now that I've sort of set the stage and provided some background on program evaluation and why do it and what to evaluate and when, I want to step back for just a minute and say, does it actually make sense for you to conduct a program evaluation? And I will do that within the context of the CBF example that I illustrated for you earlier. Did it actually make sense for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to move ahead with conducting a behavioral outcome evaluation of their programs? In their particular case, the argument is yes. And the argument is based on the following reasoning. We did a review of over 10 behavioral outcomes evaluations that we were able to find, and we looked at what evidence is there, or what are the characteristics of these programs that lead to changes in behavior. And you're looking at here the right side of the graphic. And we found, again, based on looking at past evaluations that have been done, that when environmental education programs have the characteristics that are listed here, they're likely to lead to changes in behavior. Whereas when they have the characteristics that are listed here on the left side, they're not likely to change behavior. So when we looked at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation programs, they had 4 out of the 5 characteristics here, making it likely that their programs actually have the chance to have that behavioral outcome, and therefore it made sense to actually proceed. If, on the other hand, they would have had the features in the left side, the argument would be that conducting a program evaluation would not be what you want to do as a first step, because most likely you would have found that your programs did not change behavior, and hence you've really wasted the resources that you put into evaluating a program that's unlikely to have that particular outcome based on what we know from past evaluations and past research. To give you another example, we've been working with NOAA on evaluating their meaningful watershed education experiences. And for that program, before we moved ahead with a program evaluation, we also conducted a literature review. And if you go to this particular website address and you click right here, you can get access to that literature review to try to understand what are the features of successful watershed education efforts, and then use that information to help inform our program evaluation to make sure that what we focused on in the evaluation made sense for this particular program. So just to restate, when at all possible, you would want to do a literature review that tells you about how likely it is that based on your particular program's features, it might have the outcomes that you're interested in. Because if the literature review suggests that that's unlikely, you may want to adjust your program first before you invest all the resources that program evaluation takes. So now we're going to move on to an actual example of how you could move ahead with conducting an evaluation should that literature review we talked about ideally tell you that it makes sense to go ahead. And let's assume that you've decided to evaluate one of your one-day professional development workshops. So this is what you want to do. Now how do you proceed? My recommendation in that regard is to use a resource that I developed with the help of a lot of other wonderful environmental educators and students. It's called My Environmental Education Evaluation Resource Assistant, or MEERA, and it's free, and the address is right here. So let's explore MEERA and see how it could help you evaluate your program, including that one-day professional development. We're not going to go on the actual online site because we have found in past tests that there's some difficulty in making that happen on a timely basis. And so I've taken some screenshots. When you go to the MEERA website, you will find that the top looks just like this. So if you're interested in conducting an evaluation of your program, you're going to want to go to this Plan and Evaluation tab. And when you click on it, you'll see a menu of steps that you can follow. And the first step is what you should think about before you get started with your program evaluation. I'd like to say that these screenshots you're about to see are just small excerpts of each of those pages. I selected some examples so that you can get a feel for what is on the site, but there's a lot more on each of the steps that we'll go through. So when you're thinking about doing a program evaluation, it's very important for you to think about, do you actually have all the resources that you will need in order to complete a successful evaluation? Might you, for example, need an evaluator because you just don't know enough to proceed on your own? Or are you really willing to dedicate the time it takes? Conducting quality evaluations takes time. Do you have the financial resources to spend on an evaluation? So this particular step is very useful to go through because it helps you think about all the things that you should have in place to ultimately ensure that you'll have a successful evaluation. On this page, also notice that throughout MEERA, there's sort of tips and suggestions, special tips. And if you were to click, for example, on this one, it would tell you what kind of % of your budget you might want to think about to allocating to evaluation. And you're going to have to go here and click on it to find out what it is we recommend. So next, now that you've sort of thought about what you have to have in place to do your program evaluation, a very important next step is to complete a logic model. And I suspect most of you are familiar with that, and so I won't go into great depth. But it's really important, essentially, to really understand your program. What is it you're trying to achieve your program, and on what assumption is that program based? What are you actually doing to try to achieve those outcomes? Because you have to lay all that out in order to ultimately decide what you want to focus on. So with your workshop, what are you trying to achieve through your workshop? What kind of changes in attitudes, knowledge, skills, aspirations, behaviors? And then what is it you're actually doing during the workshop in terms of content you're delivering and how you're delivering that content that you think is contributing to those outcomes? And only once you have really articulate that clearly should you then think about what you might actually want to focus your evaluation on. That's actually the focus of step 3. And in step 3, it walks you through, what goals you might want to have, what evaluation questions you want to focus on, what indicators you might want to use for your success. Here I've selected an example from MEERA that focuses on helping you prioritize your evaluation questions. So with that workshop that we're talking about, there are probably a lot of different outcomes you're interested in, and you're interested in probably what certain features of the workshop might lead to those. And here's a tool that can help you figure out, prioritize those questions. In my experience, that's one of the most difficult things that different stakeholders have to go through, is actually narrow down those questions, because most of us have so many questions about our program that we want to answer, and an evaluation, in light of limited resources, must focus only on a few. And so here are some resources in that step to help you narrow down what you want to focus in on, in this case, in terms of evaluating your workshop. The next step is choosing your design and tool for the evaluation. So for example, with that workshop we're talking about, you might want to not just collect quantitative data through a questionnaire. You might also want to collect qualitative data through interviews or focus groups, or you might want to take some photographs or videotapes. And so this step kind of introduces you to all the different types of data you could collect and how you might do that. After you have thought through that in terms of what kind of data you want to collect, then comes the data collection process. Here I've selected a section on how big your sample should be. Often I find people are under the impression that they have to have everyone respond, for example, to a questionnaire, and that's not really the case. This table shows you, if your workshop has a certain number of participants, how big does your sample have to be in order to draw sound conclusions from your data. So this step helps you with that process. Then, once you've collected your data, you need to figure out, what the results actually tell you. You need to analyze your data. And in MEERA, as part of this step, it provides you some guidance how to do that, and some points you to resources that you can use. So, for example, if you want to use, if you collect quantitative data through a survey, let's say, at the end of the workshop, you can use Excel to analyze those results. Excel is usually, most of us now have Excel available to us, and this guide walks you through that process step by step. I should also say, this allows me to say that MEERA links you to a lot of different resources you can use to learn more about something. So in this case, it tells you that this using Excel for analyzing survey questionnaires is a good guide for somebody with beginning knowledge around evaluation, versus this other resource that's available is one that's also suitable for people who have a lot more experience with evaluation. So MEERA provides you with some key things to think about, and then usually always points you to additional resources to learn more about a particular subject. In terms of reporting results, once you've analyzed your data from this workshop, you need to figure out how to report the results. And on this page, you'll find all kinds of suggestions for that, including how to use graphics to effectively convey your messages. I found most individuals, respond very favorably to graphics, but we don't know how to produce very good ones. And so this part of MEERA gives you some suggestions on that front. And I have to say, so for most people, they stop at that previous process. They've produced an evaluation report, maybe a presentation, and they view that as the end of that. But remember, a quality evaluation isn't just about documenting, your successes and maybe some of the limitations of your programs. It's about using that information to improve your programs. And so MEERA through step 8 reminds you about that. And so one of the things you might want to do is, after you've evaluated the results from that one-day professional development, think about your evaluation. How could you have improved it? And also document the kinds of changes that you made as a result of your evaluation. And maybe you can use that information in subsequent grant proposals that you write to conduct future workshops to illustrate how you've learned from your evaluation and how you've used it to improve your programs. So in summary, if you're about to or you're interested in conducting a program evaluation, I recommend that you follow MEERA's 8 steps for taking you through that process. The other thing that MEERA offers, if you go to the sample EE evaluation section, is we have about 40 program evaluations that you can search through. And I know you can't read this, but you can search by program type. So let's say you want to evaluate a field trip program. You can pick that as a type. And then you can say, let's say you want to evaluate whether or not it changed behavior. You can click that under the evaluation column. And so you can use this searchable database to help you find examples of similar evaluations and how other environmental educators have evaluated those programs, so that you can learn from them. We have both summaries of those evaluations and in-depth profiles that you can't see here that just provide a wealth of knowledge that you can draw on as well to inform your program evaluation. So why should you use MEERA? I'm hoping that as a result of the slides you've seen, that you can see that MEERA has a lot to offer you if you're trying to do an evaluation. But just some other features, you should know that MEERA is based on research on how people learn about evaluation. MEERA also takes advantage of the many outstanding resources that are out there. So for example, you can see here, if you're looking to find an external evaluator, there are all kinds of directories you can draw on. MEERA links you to those resources. The other thing, though, that MEERA does is it doesn't provide you with too many choices, because we find too many choices are overwhelming. So usually we've picked just the best resources on a particular subject matter to help you. And while MEERA is useful for both folks that do not have much of an evaluation background, and whenever there's a resource that says beginner, then that particular resource is highly appropriate for somebody in that context. But MEERA also provides resources for people who have a little bit more evaluation experience and even those with advanced knowledge. And these tabs help you figure out what resource is appropriate for which type of individual. The whole website was designed to sort of act as a personal consultant, so you can see how there's always a question and then an answer. So that's how a consultant would interact with you. He or she would ask you questions and then offer responses. And finally, MEERA has actually itself been evaluated, and we have found, and I'll show you those results in a minute, that it can indeed help environmental educators effectively evaluate their programs. Let me show you some of the results from that evaluation. So we found that folks that had environmental educators who'd never evaluated their program used MEERA, and as a result, increased in their knowledge about evaluation and in their skills. I realize you can't read this graphic, but this is an assessment of a range of skills related to knowledge, to evaluation, before and after the use of MEERA. And you can see before the use of MEERA, environmental educators ranked their relevant evaluation knowledge and skills relatively low, and afterwards relatively high. By the way, that is also a very good technique that you can use as part of your workshop evaluation instrument that we just talked about, where you can ask people to evaluate themselves before and after your workshop, and you can then illustrate these kinds of changes that have taken place as a result of your intervention. We also have evidence that environmental educators who had very limited experience who used MEERA actually completed evaluations, and they completed them such that they were able to use the information they learned to improve their programs. But I would like to say that one thing we also learned from that evaluation of MEERA is that MEERA works best when it is combined with working with an external evaluator. So ideally, if you don't have a lot of evaluation experience, you would use MEERA to go through the steps, but as you do, also work with an external evaluator. So for example, you could use step 2, the logic model page, to create your own logic model using MEERA's guidance, and then show it to an external evaluator and get his or her input and help for your particular program. The reason that works so well is because if you work with an external evaluator, not MEERA, you have to start from scratch, and that's going to be much more costly. Versus if an external evaluator is just responding to something you've already created, you're going to be able to save yourself a lot of resources. And of course, then an external evaluator can also give you program-specific advice, which MEERA is not able to do, even though it has a lot of examples that you're likely to be able to draw from and find relevant for your particular evaluation. So just to illustrate that, in terms of, let's say, go back again to this professional development workshop you want to evaluate, here's a sample questionnaire that could be used. And while MEERA can help you figure out whether or not you want to do a questionnaire and can help you figure out how to ask questions that are good questions to include in a questionnaire, it is with an evaluator that you can get the kind of input that would help you make this tool more specific for your program. So here I've highlighted some outcomes that were relevant for the particular workshop that we wanted to evaluate. And we've also included a series of demographic questions. And let me just say that if you do instruments like this, it is always, I find, few people include demographic questions, such as, what type of participants you have and what their background is. And that is really critical to do, not only to describe, for example, who was it who participated in your workshop, but you can see also that teachers who might have a lot more teaching experience are going to have very different outcomes than teachers with a lot less teaching experience. So making sure you ask that as part of your questionnaire is important, so you can make sure that you can control for differences in your outcomes based on the background of the program participants. And this is the kind of what specific demographics you might want to, or background questions you might want to ask about, is something that an external evaluator can help you with as it relates to your particular program. So now let me just switch topics a bit. We're coming towards the end of this webinar. Let me say MEERA is one resource that can help you learn a lot about evaluation and walk you through the evaluation process, but there are also several additional wonderful opportunities to help you learn about program evaluation. One is courses. There are actually courses you can complete on the topic that are offered through the EE Capacity Project, as well as through the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and I've provided the links here for you, so I encourage you to check that out if you want to learn more about evaluation. And another opportunity is at the NAAEE Conference. We started this last year, and it was very successful, so we're doing it again this year. I have leading environmental evaluation experts coming to a clinic, and you can bring your questions, and we'll be sitting at round tables, and we'll be taking your questions and helping you answer them. So it'd be great if you would join us for that event, and I know that last year's participants found it very helpful in terms of answering their specific evaluation questions. So the main takeaways from this webinar is that I want you to remember that quality evaluations don't provide just some information about, the successes or limitations about your programs, but they should be designed such they can provide you information about how you can improve your programs. At the same time, I think not enough people think first whether or not they're ready for an evaluation. And it might be best to conduct a review of your program first based on what we know from research on what may or may not make your program successful. You should definitely consider evaluating all aspects of your program. Most people want to learn about the outcomes, and that's very understandable. But if the inputs and activities are not in place, the outcomes are unlikely. Just like you're not going to have environmental impact if there aren't actual behavior changes. So all of these aspects can and should be evaluated in the hierarchy that we talked about. And last but not least, you are not without resources. You have MEERA to draw on, there are courses for you to draw on, and there are many additional opportunities for you to learn about program evaluation. So with that, if you have any questions you would like answered about evaluation, or you would like to learn more about evaluation through a subsequent follow-up, please email myself or email Lori Mann and let us know what you're interested in learning more about, and we'll try to see what we can do to answer your questions. Thank you so much for all the attention you gave to this webinar. I only wish I would have had a chance to interact with you all, and hopefully I get to meet you one of these days at NAAEE or at other settings. With that, I'll hand it over for some final comments to Katie.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for sharing your expertise in evaluation. I know it's something that we have a lot of folks interested in, so this was fabulous. Thank you again for your time and expertise. And I just want to invite everyone to attend our next webinar in the series, which is Collective Impact in Environmental Education, and that will be on July 28th, 4 p.m. Eastern, presented by the Civic Canopy. Bill Fulton and Hannah Nichols will be there to provide their expertise on how collective impact could be a tool for environmental education. So I hope you'll join us, and stay tuned for details about an additional webinar in August on fundraising for environmental education. Thank you again to Michaela and to NAAEE, and have a great rest of your day.